The crosshairs settle on a man's back. Through the scope, the world becomes a tunnel, a narrow passage between life and death, where a single breath can end everything. The target stumbles through the snow, his uniform torn, his boots wrapped in rags. He doesn't know he's being watched. He doesn't know that 300 yards away, a finger rests on a trigger, and orders have been given. Kill them all. Leave no witnesses. Make it clean. But something's wrong. The sniper's heartbeat, usually steady as a metronome, begins to race. His breath fogs the frozen air inside his hide. The man in his sights falls to his knees, not from a bullet, but from exhaustion. Behind him, others collapse too. They're not soldiers anymore, they're ghosts, walking skeletons in the shape of men. And the order still stands: eliminate the entire column. This is January 1945. The place is somewhere in Poland where the snow doesn't fall, it attacks. Where the cold doesn't chill, it kills. The Soviet army is pushing west, crushing everything in its path, and these men, these prisoners, are loose ends. Witnesses to atrocities. Liabilities. They've been marched through hell, and now they're supposed to disappear. Quietly, efficiently, with a bullet. The sniper's name is Nikolai Volkov. He's 24 years old. He's killed 47 men, each one recorded, each one approved. He's a hero of the Soviet Union, a ghost in the snow, a shadow that brings death. But today, something inside him cracks. Today, he sees his brother's face in that scope, his father's eyes, his own reflection. And for the first time in 3 years of war, Nikolai Volkov does the unthinkable. He lowers his rifle. He turns off his radio. And he makes a choice that will echo through the decades. A choice between orders and humanity, between the machine and the man. What happens next will save 200 lives. And it will destroy his own. This is his story. And it's about to cost him everything. The Eastern Front wasn't a battlefield. It was a graveyard with a pulse. From Stalingrad to Berlin, 27 million Soviet citizens died. Not just soldiers, citizens. Men, women, children, swallowed by a war that devoured everything. The Soviet war machine was ruthless, efficient, and absolutely unforgiving. You obeyed or you vanished. There was no middle ground, no gray area, no room for conscience. In this frozen nightmare, snipers were ghosts. They were the silent dealers of death, the invisible hand of Soviet power. They didn't charge into battle, they waited, they watched, they calculated. And when the moment was perfect, they erased a life with a single shot. Nikolai Volkov was one of the best. Trained in the mountains of the Urals, hardened by the siege of Leningrad, shaped into a weapon by the NKVD Stalin's secret police. He was a tool, a very sharp, very obedient tool. But tools aren't supposed to think. They're not supposed to feel. And they're definitely not supposed to disobey. Yet, on a gray morning in January 1945, somewhere in the blood-soaked snow of occupied Poland, Nikolai Volkov did exactly that. He was given a simple order: eliminate a column of 200 prisoners, German collaborators, traitors, witnesses to Soviet war crimes. They were being marched east, away from the advancing front, away from liberation. They were loose ends. And loose ends, in Stalin's army, were cut without hesitation. Nikolai set up his position before dawn. He had 3 other snipers with him, all younger, all eager to prove themselves. The plan was surgical: take out the guards, then the prisoners. Make it look like a German ambush. Clean, quiet, erased from history. But when Nikolai looked through his scope and saw those men, broken, beaten, barely alive, something inside him shattered. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the weight of 47 kills. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the last flicker of the man he used to be. He made a decision that would ripple through time. He told his team to stand down. He falsified the radio report. He let 200 men walk into the forest and disappear. And when the NKVD found out, and they always found out, Nikolai Volkov became a ghost of a different kind. Not a hero, a traitor, a warning, a name erased from every record, buried in every file, whispered only in the darkest corners of Soviet history. Until now, if you love real stories, full of emotion, courage, and secrets from the past, Subscribe to the channel now and hit that bell. Drop a like to support this work and help this story reach more people. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this video from? I love knowing how far these stories travel. Nikolai Volkov was born in 1921. In a village so small it didn't have a name on any map, just a cluster of wooden houses huddled against the Ural Mountains like frightened animals. His father was a hunter, his mother a schoolteacher. Life was simple, brutal, and honest. You worked, you survived, you died. There were no grand dreams in that village, no promises of glory. Just the mountains, the wolves, and the endless cold. Nikolai learned to shoot before he learned to read, tracking foxes and deer through snow so deep it swallowed his legs. His father taught him patience, precision, and respect for the kill. Never waste a shot, the old man would say. Every bullet is a piece of your soul. When the war came in 1941, it came like a flood, fast, merciless, unstoppable. The Germans tore through the Soviet Union, burning villages, slaughtering civilians, pushing toward Moscow like a plague. Nikolai was 20 years old when the conscription officers arrived. They didn't ask, they took. Within a week, he was on a train heading west, away from the mountains, away from everything he knew. The train was packed with boys like him, farm boys and factory workers, all wearing the same look. Terror disguised as determination. They sang patriotic songs to drown out the fear, but Nikolai stayed silent. He was already calculating angles, distances, wind speed. He was already a sniper, he just didn't know it yet. His talent was discovered by accident. During basic training, an officer noticed Nikolai could hit targets others couldn't even see. 300 yards, 400, 500, it didn't matter. His shots were clean, precise, almost supernatural. The officer reported him to the NKVD, and within a month, Nikolai was pulled from his unit and sent to a special training camp in the frozen wastelands of Siberia. This wasn't a school, it was a forge. They broke him down, rebuilt him, turned him into something cold and efficient. They taught him to kill without hesitation, to disappear without a trace, to obey without question. They showed him films of German atrocities, told him stories of villages burned and children executed. They filled his heart with rage and his mind with duty. By 1942, Nikolai was deployed to the Leningrad front, where the city was being strangled by a 900-day siege. People were eating wallpaper, boiling leather boots, dying in the streets by the thousands. Nikolai's job was simple. Kill German officers, disrupt supply lines, create fear. He was good at it. Too good. His first kill was a German captain inspecting trenches. 800 yards, one shot, clean through the temple. He felt nothing. No pride, no guilt, just the cold satisfaction of a job done right. Over the next 2 years, he added 46 more names to his tally. Each one approved. Each one necessary. Each one erasing a little more of the boy from the mountains. But something was happening inside him, something he couldn't name. With every kill, he felt himself fading, becoming more ghost than man. He stopped writing letters home. He stopped dreaming. He stopped feeling anything except the recoil of his rifle and the silence after the shot. His commanders praised him, decorated him, called him a hero of the Soviet Union. But Nikolai knew the truth. He wasn't a hero, he was a machine. A very efficient, very obedient machine. And machines don't have souls. By January 1945, the war was almost over. The Soviets were driving toward Berlin, crushing the German army under an avalanche of steel and blood. Victory was inevitable. But the closer they got to the end, the darker the orders became. Witnesses had to be silenced. Collaborators had to be eliminated. Loose ends had to be cut. Nikolai had survived 3 years of the worst war in human history, but he was about to face his hardest battle yet. Not against the enemy, against himself. The boy who learned to hunt in the Ural Mountains was gone. What remained was a ghost with a rifle, standing at the edge of a choice that would define the rest of his life. And the clock was ticking. The orders came through at 0400 hours, crackling over the radio like the voice of God, cold, distant, absolute. Nikolai was in a farmhouse 20 miles behind the front lines. a structure so damaged by artillery that the walls stood only out of habit. He sat in the corner, cleaning his rifle with the ritualistic precision of a priest preparing for communion. The Mosin-Nagant was an extension of his body now, 5 feet of wood and steel that had become more familiar than his own hands. He knew every scratch, every dent, every imperfection in the worn metal. Outside, the wind howled like something dying, and the snow fell in sheets so thick the world disappeared beyond 10 feet. The voice on the radio belonged to Major Petrov, an NKVD officer Nikolai had never met but whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. Petrov was the kind of man who signed execution orders over breakfast and slept like a baby. He spoke in clipped, efficient sentences, each word sharp as a blade. Volkov, you have a priority assignment. A column of 200 prisoners is being marched east from the Vistula pocket. German collaborators, traitors, witnesses to partisan executions. They cannot reach Soviet territory. Eliminate the guards, eliminate the prisoners. Make it look like enemy action. Understood. The line went silent, waiting for the only acceptable response. Nikolai stared at the radio for a long moment, his jaw tight. Around him, 3 younger snipers, boys, really none older than 19, watched with the eager eyes of wolves who'd never known hunger. They'd heard stories about Nikolai Volkov, the ghost of Leningrad, the man with 47 confirmed kills. They wanted to learn from him, to be like him, to earn their own legends. Nikolai finally pressed the transmit button. Understood, Comrade Major. It will be done. His voice was flat, emotionless, perfect. He released the button and stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. The boys scrambled to their feet, ready to follow him into hell if he asked. They moved out before dawn, for shadows gliding through a landscape that looked like the end of the world. The snow had buried everything. Roads, fences, entire villages swallowed by white silence. Nikolai led them north, navigating by instinct and a compass that barely worked in the cold. They traveled for 6 hours without speaking, communicating only through hand signals and the occasional glance. This was how snipers moved, invisible, patient, part of the landscape itself. By noon, they reached the intercept point, a ridge overlooking a narrow valley where the forest pressed close on both sides. It was a perfect kill zone, a natural ambush site that made Nikolai's tactical mind hum with dark satisfaction. He positioned his team with the precision of a chess master. 2 snipers on the western ridge, 1 on the eastern slope, and himself in the center, elevated with clear lines of sight to everything below. They dug shallow hides in the snow, covering themselves with white fabric until they became part of the winter itself. Then they waited. Waiting was 90% of a sniper's life, waiting for the wind to calm, waiting for the target to appear, waiting for the perfect moment when all variables aligned. Nikolai had waited for 16 hours once, motionless, barely breathing, until his target stepped into the open for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all he needed. 3 seconds was all anyone ever got. The column appeared at 1,530 hours, a ragged line of humanity stumbling through the snow like a funeral procession. Nikolai counted them through his scope. 207 prisoners, 12 guards, all moving with the mechanical shuffle of the utterly exhausted. The prisoners wore a mixture of uniforms: German Wehrmacht, Polish Home Army, even some Soviet uniforms with the insignia torn off. Traitors and collaborators, the NKVD called them, witnesses and loose ends. Men who'd seen things the Soviet Union wanted buried forever. The guards were NKVD troops, hard-faced men in long coats, their rifles slung carelessly, confident that their prisoners were too broken to resist. But then Nikolai made the mistake every sniper is trained to avoid. He looked too closely. Through the magnification of his scope, the prisoners weren't numbers anymore, they were men. He saw a young Polish soldier, maybe 16, his face so thin the skull showed through. An old man with a German uniform, walking with a cane made from a tree branch. A Soviet deserter with hollow eyes that had seen too much and believed in nothing. They weren't marching, they were dying in slow motion, one step at a time. And Nikolai realized, with a cold certainty that made his stomach turn, that he was about to murder 200 men who'd already been murdered by this war. He was about to become the executioner for an empire that called it justice. His finger found the trigger, muscle memory taking over where thought had stopped. The first target was easy. The lead guard, a captain with medals on his chest. 800 yards. Minimal wind. The shot was perfect until Nikolai's hand began to shake. The shaking started in his trigger finger and spread like poison through his entire hand. Nikolai had never trembled before a shot. Not once in 3 years, not through 47 kills, not even during his first when his heart had hammered like a drum and his breathing came in ragged gasps. A sniper who shakes is a dead sniper, his instructors had drilled into him. Control is everything. The body is a machine, the mind is the operator, and emotion is the enemy. But now, staring through that scope at men who looked more like corpses than prisoners, Nikolai felt something he thought the war had burned out of him. Doubt. He forced himself to breathe, slow and measured, the way he'd been taught. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let the crosshairs settle. Find the rhythm between heartbeats where the world goes still and time stops. The NKVD captain was lighting a cigarette, his profile sharp against the white snow. It would be an easy shot, textbook perfect. After the captain fell, the other guards would panic, scatter, and Nikolai's team would cut them down in seconds. Then the prisoners, confused, unarmed, trapped in the kill zone, would be fish in a barrel. The entire operation would take less than 5 minutes. Clean, efficient, erased from history, but Nikolai couldn't pull the trigger. His mind kept replaying something his father had told him when he was 8 years old, after his first deer kill. They tracked it for hours through the mountains, and when Nikolai finally took the shot, the deer had dropped instantly. He'd run to it, excited, proud, and then he'd seen its eyes. Still alive, still aware, staring at him with an expression that looked almost like betrayal. His father had knelt beside him in the snow and said, "A hunter respects the kill. He takes only what he needs and he never, ever kills for sport. The moment you kill without purpose, you're not a hunter anymore. You're just a murderer with a gun." Purpose. The word echoed in Nikolai's head like a church bell. What was the purpose here? These men were already defeated, already broken. They posed no threat to anyone. The war was over for them. They'd lost everything, their countries, their armies, their futures. Executing them wouldn't change the course of the war. It wouldn't save Soviet lives. It would just be murder dressed up in military necessity. Another atrocity buried under paperwork and lies. And Nikolai would be the hand that pulled the trigger, the ghost that made it happen, the machine that followed orders without question. Through his peripheral vision, he could see his team waiting for his shot, the signal that would start the slaughter. They trusted him completely, these boys with their eager eyes and clean consciences. They'd never questioned an order, never hesitated, never allowed themselves to see their targets as human beings. They were perfect soldiers, exactly what the Soviet Union needed. And Nikolai realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins, that he couldn't do it. He couldn't murder 200 broken men just because someone 300 miles away had decided they were inconvenient. He couldn't be that machine anymore. His hand moved to the radio and for a moment he considered calling it in. Telling Petrov the column had been ambushed by German forces before he could intercept, that there were no survivors, mission accomplished. But lying to the NKVD was suicide. They had ways of verifying everything, networks of informers, records cross-checked and triple-checked. If he filed a false report, they'd know. And then it wouldn't just be him. They'd execute his entire family, everyone he'd ever known, everyone he'd ever spoken to. That was how the system worked. That was how it stayed strong. So Nikolai made a different choice, one that had no logic, no strategy, no hope of success. He made the choice of a man who'd rather die human than live as a machine. He turned off his radio. He signaled his team to hold position. And then, moving with the same careful precision he used for everything, he adjusted his scope away from the NKVD captain and aimed at the tree line 300 yards beyond the column. He squeezed the trigger, and the shot cracked through the frozen air like thunder. The bullet hit a pine tree, sending bark and snow exploding into the air. A warning shot that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. The column erupted in chaos. Guards shouted, prisoners scattered. and Nikolai watched through his scope as 200 men who'd been walking toward death suddenly found the will to run toward life. They disappeared into the forest like ghosts, swallowed by trees and snow and the impossible mercy of a sniper who decided to miss. And in that moment, Nikolai Volkov stopped being a hero of the Soviet Union and became something far more dangerous. A man with a conscience in a world that had no use for one. The silence after the shot was deafening. Nikolai's team stared at him with expressions that shifted from confusion to horror to something approaching understanding. Though they didn't want to understand, didn't want to believe what they just witnessed. The youngest sniper, a kid named Dmitri with freckles and hands too big for his body, crawled through the snow toward Nikolai's position, his face white as the landscape around them. "Comrade Volkov," he whispered, his voice shaking. You missed. You never miss." It wasn't an accusation yet, just a statement of impossible fact, like saying the sun had risen in the west. Nikolai didn't answer immediately. He watched through his scope as the last of the prisoners vanished into the forest, the NKVD guards scrambling in all directions, convinced they were under attack by German forces. It would take them hours to regroup, to realize what had actually happened. By then, those 200 men would be scattered across 50 square miles of frozen wilderness, impossible to track, impossible to recapture. Some would die from exposure. Some would be caught by German patrols. But some, maybe 50, maybe 100, would survive. They'd live because one sniper had decided that following orders wasn't the same as doing what was right. He finally turned to look at Dmitri, and what the boy saw in Nikolai's eyes made him flinch. There was no confusion there, no accident, no mistake. Just cold certainty and the terrible peace of a man who'd made an irreversible choice. "I didn't miss," Nikolai said quietly. "Ishuz." The words hung in the frozen air between them like a confession and a challenge. Dmitri's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The other two snipers had crawled closer now, listening, their young faces struggling to process what this meant. What it meant for them, for their hero, for everything they'd been taught to believe. "But the orders," stammered Pyotr, the oldest of the three at 19, a farm boy from Ukraine who'd watched the Germans burn his village and rape his sister. Major Petrov said. Nikolai cut him off with a gesture. "I know what Petrov said. I know what we were ordered to do. And I'm telling you now, we're not doing it. Those men down there are defeated. They're no threat to anyone. Killing them would be murder, not war. And I've done enough killing for one lifetime." His voice was steady, almost gentle, but underneath it was steel. The same steel that had made him the best sniper in the Red Army, now turned against the very machine that had created him. The three young snipers exchanged glances, a wordless conversation happening in the space of heartbeats. They were at a crossroads, Nikolai realized. They could report him, turn him in to the NKVD, claim they'd tried to stop him, save their own skins and probably earn commendations for loyalty. Or they could follow him into whatever hell was coming, stand beside a traitor, and throw away their futures for a principle they weren't even sure they believed in. It was an impossible choice, the kind that aged men in minutes. Nikolai wouldn't blame them if they chose survival. He'd lost the right to judge anyone the moment he'd pulled that trigger. Dmitri spoke first, his voice barely audible over the wind. "My father was arrested in 1937, during the purges. They said he was a saboteur, an enemy of the people. He was a schoolteacher. He taught children to read." The boy's hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. "They shot him in the basement of Lubyanka prison, and they made my mother pay for the bullet. I joined the army to prove we were loyal, to wash away the stain on our family name. But if we do this, if we murder those men down there, we're no different from the people who murdered my father." Tears were freezing on his cheeks, but his eyes were clear, decided. Pyotr nodded slowly. Then the third sniper, a silent kid from Leningrad named Vasily, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words since Nikolai had met him. They were making their choice, these boys, and Nikolai felt his heart break and swell at the same time. They were choosing conscience over survival, humanity over the machine. They were choosing to be men instead of weapons. And it was going to destroy them. The NKVD didn't forgive, didn't forget, didn't accept excuses. When Petrov discovered what had happened, and he would discover it probably within hours, A death warrant would be signed for all four of them. Their families would be arrested. Their names would be erased. They would become unpersons, ghosts whose existence was denied by the very state they'd bled for. Nikolai looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces, knowing that this moment, this small act of rebellion in a frozen Polish forest, might be the only monument they ever got. Then he reached for his radio, turned it back on, and did something that sealed all their fates. He told the truth. The radio crackled to life with Petrov's voice, sharp and impatient, already suspicious from the long silence. Volkov, report. Status of the mission. I want confirmation codes and body counts. Now. Nikolai held the transmitter in his hand for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Not the physical weight, but the metaphysical burden of what speaking into this small metal box would unleash. Around him, his three companions watched with the stillness of men witnessing an execution. In a way, they were. This transmission would be their death sentence, spoken in Nikolai's own voice, broadcast across military frequencies where every word would be recorded, archived, and used as evidence. He pressed the button and spoke with the same calm precision he'd used for 3 years of perfect obedience. Comrade Major, this is Volkov. Mission status. Incomplete. The prisoners have been released into the forest. The guards are scattered. No casualties on either side. I take full responsibility for this decision. The silence that followed was so profound that Nikolai could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the breathing of the boys around him, could hear the wind moving through the trees like the whisper of something ancient and sad. Then Petrov's voice returned, and it was no longer the voice of a military officer. It was the voice of the machine itself, cold and certain as winter. Say that again, Volkov. I want to be absolutely clear what you just reported. There was no anger in Petrov's tone yet, just the mechanical precision of a bureaucrat confirming details before filing the paperwork that would end a man's life. Nikolai obliged him, speaking each word slowly, clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. I was ordered to execute 200 prisoners. I chose not to follow that order. The prisoners are free. I await consequences. He released the button and turned off the radio, knowing that Petrov was already making calls, already setting machinery in motion that couldn't be stopped. In Moscow, in NKVD headquarters, files were being opened. Arrest warrants were being typed. Interrogators were being assigned. Dmitri was the first to speak, his voice oddly calm now that the worst had been confirmed. How long do we have? It was a practical question, asked without hysteria, and Nikolai appreciated the steadiness in it. 12 hours, maybe less. Petrov will send a security detachment from the nearest garrison. They'll come fast and they'll come heavy, full platoon probably, maybe more. They won't take chances with 4 armed snipers who've gone rogue. He began breaking down his rifle with practiced efficiency, each movement automatic, muscle memory taking over while his mind calculated angles, distances, possibilities. They had choices now, all of them bad, but choices nonetheless. They could run west, try to reach American or British lines, defect to the other side. But they were 300 miles behind Soviet lines, in territory crawling with Red Army units. They'd be hunted every step of the way, and crossing into Allied territory was nearly impossible. The front was a meat grinder of dying Germans and advancing Soviets, with no gaps, no safe passages. They could try to disappear into the Polish countryside, become partisans, live like ghosts. But Polish partisans were being rounded up and executed by both Soviets and Germans. There was no safe harbor there, just a slower death. Or they could surrender, face trial, and hope for mercy from a system that had never shown mercy to anyone. Nikolai had already made his choice before the others finished considering theirs. I'm going back, he said simply, slinging his disassembled rifle over his shoulder. I'm going to walk into NKVD headquarters and tell them everything. Why I did it, what I saw, what I couldn't do. They'll arrest me. They'll probably execute me. But I'm going to make them hear it first. I'm going to make them acknowledge, even if only in some basement interrogation room, that what we were ordered to do was murder. The 3 young snipers stared at him as if he'd announced he was going to walk to the moon. It was suicide, pure and simple, suicide without even the dignity of dying quickly. But Pyotr understood first. his Ukrainian peasant's wisdom cutting through to the truth beneath the words. You want to leave a record, something they can't erase completely, so that someday, maybe decades from now, someone might find it and know what really happened here. Nikolai nodded slowly. The Soviet Union is very good at making people disappear, at rewriting history, at turning truth into lies. But they're also obsessive about documentation. They record everything, file everything, archive everything. My confession will go into a file somewhere. It might be buried for 50 years, 100 years, but it will exist. And existence is a kind of immortality. His smile was sad, tired, but somehow still human, still a smile. The decision spread through the group like dawn breaking, slow and inevitable. They would all go back. They would all face the machine together. Not because they thought they'd survive, they knew they wouldn't, but because some things mattered more than survival. Some acts required witnesses. Some truths needed to be spoken, even if only to the walls of a prison cell. They packed their gear in silence, for ghosts preparing for the long walk back to the empire that would destroy them. And as they moved south through the frozen forest, leaving the place where 200 men had been given an impossible gift of life, Nikolai felt something he hadn't felt since before the war. The lightness of a clear conscience. It wouldn't keep him alive, but it would let him die as himself. They reached the military command post in Lodz 36 hours later, walking openly down the main road like men who had nothing to hide and everything to confess. The sentries at the checkpoint didn't know whether to salute or shoot. Here was Nikolai Volkov, decorated hero, walking calmly toward his own arrest with 3 young snipers following like disciples behind a condemned prophet. An officer was summoned, then another, and within minutes they were surrounded by a full security detachment, rifles pointed, hands on triggers. But there was confusion in the soldiers' eyes, hesitation, because heroes weren't supposed to look like this, calm, resolved, almost peaceful. Traitors were supposed to run, to fight, to deny. Nikolai did none of those things. He simply unbuckled his rifle, laid it at the officer's feet and said, "I'm here to surrender to the NKVD. Major Petrov is expecting me." The interrogation began immediately, in a commandeered school building that still smelled of chalk and children's laughter. Ghosts of a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Petrov himself conducted the first session, and he was everything Nikolai had imagined. A man of average height and unremarkable features whose ordinariness made him more terrifying than any monster. He wore the green cap and blue shoulder boards of the NKVD like a priest wears vestments, with absolute faith in the righteousness of his power. He sat across a wooden table from Nikolai, a folder open between them. A folder that already contained everything, every detail, every radio transmission. The machine had been thorough as always. "Help me understand, Volkov," Petrov began, his voice soft, almost fatherly. "You had 47 confirmed kills. 47 enemies of the Soviet Union eliminated with perfect efficiency. You were being considered for the Order of Lenin. You had a future, promotion, better postings, a comfortable retirement. And you threw it all away for what? 200 traitors and collaborators who deserved execution." He leaned forward, genuinely curious, as if Nikolai were a fascinating specimen in a laboratory. What could possibly be worth that? What broke inside you that made you choose them over your duty, your country, your own survival? It was the central question, the one Nikolai had been asking himself for 36 hours of walking. Nikolai met Petrov's eyes without flinching, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every life he'd taken, every death he'd witnessed, every choice that had led him to this room. "I saw my brother in that scope. My father. Myself. Those men weren't enemies anymore. They were ghosts of what this war has turned us all into. And I realized that if I pulled that trigger, if I murdered 200 defenseless men just because I was told to, then I'd be the real traitor. Not to the Soviet Union. To humanity itself. To the part of me that still remembers what it means to be human instead of a weapon." The words hung in the air like smoke, and for just a moment, barely a heartbeat, something flickered in Petrov's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or memory. The shadow of a man he might have been before the purges, before the terror, before the machine had ground his conscience into dust. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold certainty of ideology. That's your defense? Sentiment? The luxury of a guilty conscience. Petrov closed the folder with a snap that sounded like a cell door slamming. Let me tell you what those 200 men were, Volkov. They were witnesses to partisan executions in Ukraine, villages liquidated for supporting insurgents. They saw NKVD units burning buildings with families locked inside. They saw mass graves being filled. If they had lived to testify, they would have given the West ammunition for decades of propaganda. They would have undermined everything we've sacrificed for. Then maybe, Nikolai said quietly, we shouldn't have done things that need to be covered up. Maybe the problem isn't the witnesses. It's the crimes they witnessed. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that exists in the moment before an avalanche, when the snow hangs suspended and the world holds its breath. Petrov's face remained expressionless, but his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward a document on his desk. A pre-signed execution order, Nikolai realized, just waiting for a name to be filled in. The machine had anticipated everything, prepared everything, made arrangements for every possible outcome. But Petrov didn't sign it immediately. Instead, he did something unexpected. He dismissed the guards, waited until the door closed, and spoke in a voice so low it could barely be called a whisper. I'm going to tell you something, Volkov, and then we're going to pretend this conversation never happened. I was at Katyn in 1940. I helped execute 22,000 Polish officers, prisoners of war, educated men, soldiers who'd surrendered honorably. We shot them in the back of the head and buried them in mass graves. I've signed 3,000 death warrants since then. 3,000. And every single night, I see their faces. Every single night. His hands were shaking now, barely visible, a tremor so small it could have been imagination. But I keep signing because the alternative is to admit that everything, all of it, was for nothing. That we've become the very monsters we claimed to be fighting. He pushed the execution order across the table, along with a pen. You have a choice, Volkov. Sign a confession stating you suffered a mental breakdown from combat stress. Accept psychiatric imprisonment instead of execution. Your family will be spared. You'll spend the rest of your life in an asylum, but you'll live. Or maintain your principles, face the firing squad, and watch your entire bloodline get erased from history. What's it worth, this conscience of yours? Is it worth your mother's life? Your sister's? Every single person you've ever known. It was the machine's final offer, dressed up as mercy but really just another form of murder. The slow death of compromise, the erosion of self until nothing remained but obedient survival. Nikolai looked at the document for a long time, longer than the choice deserved, because he already knew his answer. He'd known it the moment he'd lowered his rifle in that frozen forest. He pushed the paper back across the table, and signed, and spoke the words that would seal not just his fate, but his place in a history that wouldn't be written for decades. Some things can't be compromised, Major. Some lines can't be uncrossed. I choose the firing squad, and I choose to die knowing that somewhere, somehow, the truth will survive us both. Petrov's face hardened back into its bureaucratic mask, and he called the guards back in with a voice that had lost all traces of humanity. The trial of Nikolai Volkov was over before it had begun. On February 14, 1945, at dawn in a prison courtyard in Warsaw, Nikolai Volkov faced a firing squad of 8 men who couldn't meet his eyes. He refused the blindfold, refused the final cigarette, and stood with his back straight as the orders were read in a voice that echoed off stone walls and disappeared into history. The shots came all at once, a single crack of thunder that ended a life but couldn't erase what it meant. In the official records, Nikolai Volkov was listed as executed for desertion and cowardice, a lie that lasted 47 years until the Soviet archives opened and a researcher found a folder marked with his name, containing one interrogation transcript and a confession that read like poetry instead of treason. The 3 young snipers who'd followed him were sentenced to 15 years in the Gulag, their youth the only thing that saved them from execution. Only one survived, Dmitry, the boy with freckles, who walked out of Kolyma in 1960 weighing 89 pounds and carrying Nikolai's story like a sacred text. He told it to his children, who told it to theirs, keeping alive the memory of a sniper who saved 200 lives by choosing to miss. Of those 200 men scattered into the Polish forest, at least 73 survived the war. Their names discovered decades later through genealogical research and testimonies collected across 3 continents. They lived, had children, built futures that wouldn't have existed without one man's refusal to pull a trigger. History doesn't always remember its heroes correctly, and sometimes the bravest acts are the ones that look like failure. A shot not taken, an order not followed, a life given up so others could live. Nikolai Volkov died believing his gesture was futile, that the machine would grind his truth into dust and scatter it to the wind. He was wrong. The truth survived. It always does, somehow. In whispered stories, in hidden documents, in the bloodlines of people who exist because one ghost decided to be human. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous act of all, choosing mercy in a world built on obedience, choosing life in an empire of death, choosing to remember when forgetting would be so much easier. CTAFINAL. If the story moved you, hit that like button right now. It helps this channel continue bringing you stories like this one that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next revelation from history's hidden corners. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? I want to see how far Nikolai's story has traveled. Before you go, click on the next video appearing in the card above. You'll be amazed at what you're about to discover. These are the stories they tried to bury. We're bringing them back to light.